Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. With the Season 5 update, of course, one of the most important changes that we got was the slight buff to the Grau, one of the all-time GOATs here in Warzone, which has everybody talking about it post-update. Is it meta? Is it now the go-to MW gun? Today, I wanted to break this down in further detail. Is the Grau truly meta? We obviously have our top tier and our meta weapons here. Unfortunately, I can't have like a top, like absolute meta category and this like very strong, super competitive category. I've tried to add alternative ones here, and it's just like, now you're good. You can stick with what you got. So a mix of these are the best of the best. A mix of them are like the most competitive ones we have out there. Then, of course, the relatively competitive, which is currently where the Grau sits. Of course, it's there alongside things like the Ram, the M4, the Automaton, the KG, so on and so forth. But could it actually slide up into this top tier, super competitive area? Today, we're discussing. So first things first, I want to take a look at just a general Grau comparison, and something that Tony's got going on here on True Game Data, as always, shout out to him for putting in the work, is the ability to see a weapon's pre-buff stats or a pre-update stats, and the post-update, obviously, which is our blue line here, and our pink line is our pre-buff Grau from before Season 5. We are, of course, looking at combination shots for the most accurate TTK, and you can see here, man, this difference is minimal. I mean, we got to be realistic here. Of course, I want to be as biased as possible when talking about the Grau because it's my all-time favorite gun in Warzone, right? But we have to look at this in an objective way to truly say, is this meta or not, right? Because I'd love for the Grau to be the best gun in the game. Don't get me wrong on that. But when you look at this, the pre-buff Grau had a 31 meter initial damage range. The post-buff Grau has a 31.5 meter damage range, first damage range. So this update, with the close range buff that it got for whatever reason, the damage buff, that max range damage is close range. I'm not sure why they buffed that rather than long range, but this update gave it a half meter better for its, initial damage drop off on combination shots. That's a minimal change. So to say, just strictly based off the patch notes themselves, that the Grau is now, this beast that it was not before, would be a little bit incorrect, because the actual true difference here is not all that much in game. However, that said, we saw nerfs and changes to several other weapons that were not the Grau, things that adjusted the Grau indirectly, made it more competitive indirectly. So while it was getting this very, very minor buff, we also saw changes to other weapons that brought them more in line with potentially where the Grau is at now. So I want to look at this next TTK chart, which really tells us the full story. And of course, time to kill is not the only factor in a meta weapon. We're also going to look at damage per second. We're going to look at recoil, the base stats of all these as well. But of course, TTK is probably the biggest part that most people look at. But here we're comparing it to several other rifles, and keep in mind, these are all the meta setups on every single one of these. We got the Grau with its primary setup. I wanted to compare it to these other non-Vanguard guns, especially to see how they stack up. So we got the Cold War AK, which yes, has a little bit more recoil, but it's also a beast. We got the XM4, which I think is probably one of the closer comparisons. You could throw the Vargo on this list too, and it'd be very similar. We also do have a couple of Vanguard guns that are close comps, the STG and the Automaton. Then I wanted to throw in another MW gun in the M4A1, which is very similar. And when we look at this TTK chart, we get some very interesting information, in my opinion. So obviously, our orange line here is the Grau, which, as you can see, through the first 48 meters has the best TTK. But we got to keep in mind what 48 meters is. Let's say 50 to keep it easy. 50 meters is in game. If you were to go into Caldera and ping 50 meters, that's not a super far distance. I mean, the Grau and obviously all these weapons really are medium to long range weapons. And yes, 50 meters falls within that medium range, but long range I consider to be, 75, 80, 90 meters and beyond, because a lot of fights, especially on Caldera, can take places in ranges like that. So yes, in that mid-range area, the Grau is very dominant, but also it is right there with some other ones. The M4 in particular here, our pink line, has basically an identical TTK through 41 meters, so the Grau only has a 7 meter advantage there. That is very minor in game, right? We got our teal line here, our blue teal line, XM4. Not all that far off. It's got 30 meters before its initial damage drop off, but then you also notice over range, the XM4 doesn't have as severe of a TTK fall off, whereas the Grau here drops off very severely at 48 meters, and then the XM4 is significantly faster to kill over long range. We also have the M4A1, which technically does have a very slight faster TTK than the Grau over range, so that'd be a lot of a preference thing. Do you prefer the M4's feel? Do you prefer the Grau's feel? Which one of those you're going to land more shots with? That's probably the one you'd want to go for over long range. We also have the Cold War AK, which while through the first 38 meters is a little bit slower, over that damage drop off, it's right there as well. Obviously much harder to control, but can absolutely dominate. And the STG and the Automaton, not all that far behind. I mean, there's a bigger gap between the XM4 and the Grau here than there is the Grau and the STG, right? So we have a super competitive rifle category here where, as far as the stats go, you can't really, at least in my opinion, can't really say yes, the Grau is clearly the go-to #1 option. And of course, when we're talking the general long range, let's be honest, the UGM is the meta. Everything else is just very competitive, which is essentially what we got going on here. But like I said, TTK is not the only thing we want to focus on when it comes to determining whether or not the Grau is the greatest gun ever, right? So while it's super competitive here, where does it stack up elsewhere? Well, in terms of damage per mag here, you'll notice it's relatively decent again through the first 48 meters. The AK though does have a beat at every single range. The AK's damage per mag is insanely good. So take that for what it's worth. Again though, recoil on the AK not as easy as these other options, but then after those first 48 meters, it's relatively competitive with other choices. The Automaton basically has an identical damage per mag, slightly better, not something you necessarily notice in game. XM4 better damage per mag, and then M4 not all that far behind either. The STG does fall off a bit here, but its damage per mag also not something that is necessarily a standout. It is very competitive, just like the TTK, but nothing to, you know, outright say this is clearly the GOAT. As far as recoil goes, this is one of those where, I mean, it is about as good as it gets. The M4, the STG, and the Grau all have ridiculously easy recoil patterns. Honestly, while the Automaton's is a lot more vertical than everything, because it is straight vertical, that's super easy to counter as well. Really, the AK's is the most difficult pattern here. Everything else is very straightforward. So I don't think there's necessarily a huge gap in terms of the recoil here, which gun is super easy, which gun is relatively easy. They're all right about the same in terms of their general competitiveness, maybe with the exception of the AK and the sheer movement on the Automaton. But like I said, because that's such a simple pattern here, that really doesn't turn out to be all that difficult. And then finally, we got the summary stats, right? Which is another interesting comparison, which gives us all the base like stats of all this stuff. So ADS time, it's relatively competitive with everything else. Obviously the Cold War AK, very slow in comparison, but it's right there with the Automaton, a little bit faster than the STG. So nothing to stand out there. Fire rate about average here. The base range is particularly good. The Automaton and the M4 are really the only ones that are close. So that's something it does have going for it. But then of course, as we saw over long range, after that damage drop off, that doesn't really reflect as much. Velocity is about even with everything else here outside of the Automaton, which has a lower velocity. The movement speed is where it suffers a little bit here. Obviously, the M4 is the only thing close. The AK, the XM4, the STG, the Automaton all do best that by a decent margin. Its ADS movement speed close to the non-Vanguard guns, but that's where Vanguard guns really come in and prove that they are dominant with 10 attachments, because their ADS movement speeds are way better here. You also got to factor in the fact that you can put in fully loaded here with no cons, whereas if you wanted to put fully loaded on the Grau, you got to waste 20% of your class setup to do so. So 10 attachments really shines there, where you can focus on so much control and mobility and damage at the same time, whereas with the Grau and these other non-Vanguard weapons with only 5 attachments, you pretty much have to commit to a little bit of control, a little bit of damage, or a little bit of range if you want. You can't really spread it all out like you could on a Vanguard gun. Everything else not necessarily super important here. The reload time is about on par with everything here. You know, the aim sway mag change, not really much of a difference, like stuff that's not super important in game. Really, these top stats here are what we want to focus on. So at the end of the day, the Grau, like I said, by far my favorite gun in the game. Is it clear and absolute meta though? I don't think so. Going back to this list, I think because of the way that I have structured this tier list, which I think I'll improve, you know, in the future for MW2, the Grau belongs in this category, but this is not a absolute meta weapon. That'd be the UGM, that'd be the PPSH, maybe the Blixen as well, and nothing else. Everything else in this category would be that top tier ultra competitive, but not absolute meta. And the Grau falls in line with that. Clearly, you could choose between the XM4, the M4A1, even the Grau. If you're more comfortable with the M4 over the Grau, you're probably going to do better with the M4. If you're more comfortable with the XM4 or the Vargo, again, if that was on the list, it'd be a little bit better as well. It really just comes down to preference there. So is the Grau better than before? Yes. Is it being a little bit overhyped? I'd also say yes, sort of in that honeymoon phase, just like what you had with the Kilo a little bit back. The Grau is a great choice right now. Not absolute meta though. That said, it's the most fun weapon I think in the game, so I'm gonna be using it a ton. If you enjoy it, you should be using it a ton as well, because I have a feeling it probably won't stay like this forever. But that said, that's where I see the Grau landing right now in the current meta post update. And that's gonna wrap things up for this one. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by dropping a like on it. And if you're new here, feel free to hit that sub button, turn on those post notifications. But once again, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take it easy, have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace out.